Welcome to Mrs. Feighery's video number 2 for the American Pageant, Chapter 31, American Life in the Roaring Twenties. The 18th Amendment and later the Volstead Act prohibited the sale of alcohol. This law was never effectively enforced because so many people violated it. Actually, most people thought that prohibition was here to stay, and this was especially popular in both the Midwest and in the South. Prohibition was particularly supported by women and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but it also posed problems from countries that produced alcohol and tried to ship it to the U.S., illegally, of course. In actuality, bank savings did increase during Prohibition, and absenteeism in the work industry did decrease. Prohibition led to the rise of gangs that competed to distribute liquor. In the gang wars of Chicago in the 1920s, about 500 people were murdered. Captured criminals were rare, and convictions were even rarer, since gangsters often provided false alibis for each other. The most infamous of these gangsters was Scarface, Al Capone, and his St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone was finally caught, but not for illegally transporting and creating alcohol, but for tax evasion. Gangs moved into other activities as well, such as prostitution, gambling, narcotics, and by 1930, their annual profit was a whopping $12 to $18 billion a year. In 1932, the gangsters kidnapped the baby son of Charles Lindbergh, shocking the nation. And this event led Congress to the so-called Lindbergh Law, which allowed the death penalty to certain cases of interstate abduction. Education also made strides during the 1920s behind the progressive ideas of John Dewey, a professor at Columbia University, who set forth principles of learning by doing and believed that education for life should be the primary goal of school. Now schools were no longer prisons. States were also placing minimum ages for teens to stay in school, so more teens were actually graduating from high school. A massive healthcare program was launched also by the Rockefeller Foundation, practically eliminating hookworm in the South. There was also a controversy that was happening in schools over evolutionism. Evolutionists were clashing against creationists, and the prime example of this was the Scopes monkey trial. John T. Scopes, who was a high school teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, was charged with teaching evolution. William Jennings Bryan was among those who were against him, but the one-time orator was made to sound very foolish and childish by the expert attorney Clarence Darrow during the trial. 5 days after the end of the trial, Bryan died. The trial proved to be very inconclusive, but it illustrated the rift between the new and the old. There were increasing numbers of Christians who were starting to reconcile their differences between religion and the findings of modern science, as evidenced in the new Churches of Christ, which were established in 1906. We'll discuss the Scopes monkey trial in one of our lessons in class. Prosperity took off in the Roaring Twenties also, despite the recession of 1920 to 1921. And it was helped by the tax policies of the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellons, during that time period, who favored the rapid expansion of capital investment. Henry Ford, during this time period, perfected assembly line production by using the moving assembly line, which is going to allow the automobile to be mass-produced. His famous Rouge River plant was producing a finished automobile, as a result, every 10 seconds. The automobile now provided more freedom, more luxury, and more privacy. And a new medium arose as well, advertising, which used persuasion, ploy, seduction, and sex appeal to sell different forms of merchandise. Americans were becoming mass consumers. In 1925, Bruce Barton's bestseller, The Man Nobody Knows, claimed that Jesus Christ was the perfect salesman and that all advertisers should study his techniques. Folks followed new and dangerous buying techniques. They, number one, bought on installment plans and on credit, which is something that the American economy had not provided in the past. Both ways were capable of plunging an unexpected consumer into debt very quickly. Sports were also buoyed by people like home run hero Babe Ruth and boxers Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier, who we'll discuss in our lessons in class as well. Americans adapted and rather than invented the gasoline engine. So people like Henry Ford and Ransom E. Olds, who is famous for creating Oldsmobile, developed the infant auto industry. Early cars stalled and weren't very reliable, but eventually, cars like the Ford Model T became very cheap and easy to own. In 1929, when the bull market collapsed, 26 million motor vehicles were registered in the United States, or about one car per every 4.9 Americans. The automobile spurred 6 million people to new jobs and took over the railroad as king of transportation. So the railroad is going to decrease during this time period. As a result of the automobile, new roads were constructed, the gasoline industry boomed, and America's standard of living rose greatly. Cars were luxuries at first, but they rapidly became necessities as people began to live more outside of the cities and travel became more necessary. The less attractive states lost population at an alarming rate as people began to move from one place to the next. Car accidents killed a lot of people, and by 1951, 1 million people had died by the car, which was more than the total Americans lost to all its previous wars combined. Cars brought adventure, excitement, and pleasure to the American consumer. On December 17, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright flew the first airplane for 12 seconds over a distance of 120 feet at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Aviation slowly got off the ground at this point, and they were used a bit in World War I for reconnaissance missions, but afterwards it really took off when they became used for mail and other functions. The first continental airmail route was established from New York to San Francisco in 1920. At first, there were many accidents and crashes, but later, safety began to improve. Charles Lindbergh, whose baby had been kidnapped, and we discussed that earlier in this video when we were talking about the gangsters and Prohibition. He became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, and when he did this in his airplane, which was called the Spirit of St. Louis, he went from New York to Paris. And this was something that made him a hero to the aviation industry. This is the works cited page. All images used in this presentation are from the public domain.